Nobody told you these things were worth keeping. Nobody explained why the milk door got sealed shut, why the ironing board got ripped out of the wall, why the cedar closet got painted over and forgotten. It didn't need explaining. You were a kid. The house just worked a certain way. The same way the street was there. The same way the school was there. You grew up around these small conveniences without ever once thinking they were smart. 13 of them, scattered through houses across the whole country. All gone now. All real. All waiting for someone to finally admit we threw out something good. Section 1. The milk door. You never once had to answer the front door to get your milk. It just showed up, sometime before the sun was all the way up, while you were still asleep, or just barely stirring under the covers. It came through a small metal door built right into the wall of your kitchen. A door so ordinary you never asked anyone what it was for, because everyone already knew. You called it the milk door, and for a long stretch of your childhood it was simply part of how the house worked, the same way the front steps or the mailbox were part of how the house worked. The whole idea was built around a simple problem nobody wanted to deal with. Your family did not want empty bottles and a little cash sitting out where anyone walking by could see them. And the milkman did not want to knock on your door before sunrise just to hand something over. So somebody built a small box straight into the outside wall near your kitchen, insulated, sometimes tin, sometimes heavier cast iron, with 2 doors facing opposite directions. One open from outside for the delivery driver. One open from inside for you or your mom or dad, whoever got to the kitchen first. The milkman swung his door open, set down the cold bottles, grabbed the empty ones from the night before, and moved on down the street to the next house. You opened your side from the kitchen and there it was. Milk that had never once touched the porch, never sat out in the sun, never needed anyone to answer a knock at all. None of it would have worked without something much smaller that came along decades before you were born. Before the late 1870s, milk did not even come in its own sealed container. A milkman carried it in bulk churns and ladled it straight into whatever jug your grandmother's grandmother happened to bring outside, which left plenty of room for spoiled batches and dirty containers and milk that had picked up grime somewhere along the route. That changed in 1878, when the first glass milk bottle got patented under the name the Lester Milk Jar, with milk sold in that new bottle for the first time the following year. Once milk had its own sealed bottle, a little door built into a wall finally made real sense. That bottle could sit safely overnight without spilling, without anyone needing to watch over the handoff in person. Those early glass bottles were built tough enough that a single one might survive around 22 round trips between the dairy and your door before it finally cracked or got lost somewhere along the way. This was never some rare feature only the wealthiest houses on the block could afford. By the 1920s, companies were building milk doors specifically for regular families, and one of the biggest names doing it advertised its own version at the time as a silent servant, a small cast iron unit that handled milk and packages without a single word passing between anyone. That same company sold coal chutes and kitchen ice boxes too, which tells you just how normal it was for a house back then to come with these little built-in delivery features as a basic part of the design, not some special extra. Units like these went into thousands of houses in cities like Chicago, and if you know where to look, entire blocks of old apartment buildings there still carry the outline of a sealed milk door hidden right in the brick. You did not need a brand new house to get one either. Through the 1930s and into the 1940s, an amendment to the Federal Housing Act opened up insured loans of up to $2,000 just for adding small upgrades like this to a house that did not already have one, milk doors included, right alongside laundry chutes, built-in cupboards, and broom closets. That kind of backing meant your grandparents could add a milk door to an older house the same way they might add a new closet, cut right into the studs of an exterior wall, no major renovation required. For a family in the 1930s or 1940s, putting one in was a perfectly reasonable weekend-sized project, not some rare architectural luxury. By the time you were growing up in the 1960s, the milk door had already been quietly working for decades, but the world around it had already started shifting into something that would eventually make it pointless. Refrigerators, once something only richer families could afford, had become close to universal by the 1940s and 1950s. Your family no longer needed milk delivered fresh every single morning because you finally had a way to keep it cold yourselves for days at a time. That one change alone, a fridge sitting in almost every kitchen in the country, did more to end the milk door than anything that came later. Pasteurization helped push things along too, since properly pasteurized milk simply lasted longer in your refrigerator than the milk your grandparents grew up drinking. which meant there was even less reason to wait around for fresh deliveries in the first place. At the same time, the whole country was spreading outward, and so was your neighborhood. Families who might once have lived close together in an old city block were now buying houses in brand new subdivisions, built farther and farther from downtown. Exactly the kind of post-war sprawl that shaped so much of American life by the early 1960s. For a milkman, that meant longer routes, more gas, more time spent driving between houses that used to sit just a few doors apart. Every extra mile cost money, and that cost eventually landed on your family's bill, right at the exact moment supermarkets were starting to look like a genuinely better deal for the first time ever. Those supermarkets offered something no milkman could easily beat: one single building where you could grab milk, bread, meat, and vegetables all in the same trip, using a car that, by the early 1960s, your family almost certainly already owned. For generations before that, dairy, meat, and bread had all come from separate little shops, each one its own stop, and its own relationship with whoever ran the counter. The supermarket folded all of that into one aisle after another under a single roof, and once big refrigerated cases became standard in those stores, the one advantage home delivery still had left, freshness nothing else could match, started disappearing too. A gallon you picked up on a Saturday grocery run could sit safely in your fridge for most of the week, so there was no real reason left to wait on the milkman at all. Even with all of that working against it, milk delivery did not disappear from your life overnight, and neither did the little door built to receive it. Research into how Americans got their milk shows that as late as the early 1960s, roughly 30% of all the milk being drunk in American homes was still arriving by delivery instead of being carried home from a store. For a good stretch of your childhood, your milk door was still doing exactly the job it had always done, quietly, every single morning, and you had no reason at all to think that arrangement was going anywhere. It was only after the decade ended that things fell apart fast. By the middle of the 1970s, that same delivery number had dropped to somewhere around 7%, with some estimates from around that same period putting household delivery as low as 15%, depending on where you lived. Either way, the number kept shrinking for the rest of the century, until by the 1990s and into the 2000s, home milk delivery barely showed up in the statistics at all. What happened to the actual doors, once your family and everyone else's stopped needing them, is a smaller, quieter story than the collapse of the milkman himself. Nobody organized some campaign to rip them all out. Nobody wrote articles at the time declaring the milk door officially dead. Families just stopped opening them, one house at a time, for the simple reason that there was nothing left worth opening them for. Some got painted over completely, sealed shut with the same coat of paint covering the rest of the wall, until the outline of a small rectangle was the only clue anything had ever been there. Others got left in place entirely, hidden behind a kitchen cabinet installed during some later remodel, so that a family gutting an old house decades later might pull out a cupboard and find a rusted little door leading straight outside, with nobody left in the house who remembers what it used to be for. A few families kept their milk doors working long after anyone actually delivered milk to them, finding smaller new uses for the same old opening, sliding the newspaper through in the morning, or leaving a spare key for a neighbor without ever having to hand it over face to face. But that was the exception, not the rule. For most houses built with a milk door somewhere in the kitchen wall, that door eventually became just a strange little feature nobody in the family could fully explain anymore. A small metal rectangle that clearly used to lead somewhere, sitting shut for good. Walk down certain older blocks today, and you can still spot a few of these on houses that have never been fully updated. Small painted-over rectangles sitting low on the outside wall, doing absolutely nothing at all. There has been a small, quiet comeback of home milk delivery in recent years, driven mostly by local dairies and people curious about where their food actually comes from. But almost none of that new delivery uses anything like your old built-in door. Milk today gets left in an insulated cooler right on the porch, basically the same setup families used before the built-in door was even invented in the first place. The door itself, the one cut straight into the wall, never really came back. It belongs to a different version of how a house was supposed to work. Looking back at it now, your old milk door stood for a particular kind of thinking that has mostly disappeared from how new houses get built. It was not flashy. It did not need electricity or any moving part beyond a simple hinge. It solved one specific everyday problem: getting fresh cold food safely from a delivery man into your kitchen without either of you ever needing to interact in person. And it solved that problem so completely that an entire industry ran smoothly around it for decades. When the need behind it disappeared, the door disappeared right along with it, not because anyone ever decided it was a bad idea, but simply because the world it was built for had quietly moved on without it, leaving nothing behind but a sealed rectangle in a wall, and, every once in a while, someone standing in an old kitchen wondering what exactly used to be there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That small door in your kitchen wall once carried the entire rhythm of a morning without anyone lifting a finger. Next, a different kind of chute worked the opposite direction, carrying your dirty laundry down through the walls of the house instead of bringing something fresh in. Section 2. The laundry chute. Your house probably had a secret built right into the walls, and you never once questioned it. A narrow shaft ran from the hallway upstairs straight down into the basement, with nothing more than a small hinged door on each floor marking where it started and ended. You dropped your dirty clothes in on the second floor, and gravity did the rest. No carrying a heavy hamper down the stairs. No thinking about it twice. The clothes disappeared into the wall and landed exactly where they needed to be, right next to the washing machine. It did not start out as something for ordinary families like yours. Laundry chutes trace back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when American cities were growing taller than ever, and it was mostly wealthy homes and grand hotels that had them first. Back then, a chute in the wall was almost a status symbol, proof your family's house was big enough and modern enough to need one. Writers of the era, caught up in the progressive movement's obsession with household efficiency, praised the idea openly, insisting an enclosed chute even helped stop the spread of disease, since soiled linens could travel straight down without touching anything or anyone along the way. For a long time, that stayed true only for houses with staff to handle the laundry once it landed. That changed by the 1920s and 1930s, when the chute made the jump from luxury feature into something genuinely middle class. In cities like Chicago, entire blocks of ordinary bungalows built during that stretch came standard with one, usually tucked into a bathroom or bedroom hallway close to wherever the dirty clothes piled up fastest. This lined up with a much bigger shift happening in houses everywhere. Electricity and the first real washing machines were pulling laundry out of the kitchen in the backyard, where it had once been an entire day's brutal chore, and moving it down into the basement instead. Once laundry had its own dedicated space down there, a chute connecting it to the rest of the house made more sense than ever. You did not need a brand new house to get one either. A 1931 trade magazine pointed out that a chute could be built into an existing home fairly easily, slotted right between the wall studs that were already there, often cut straight through the floor of a downstairs linen closet. Home magazines aimed at housewives walked readers through it step by step like any ordinary weekend project. The federal government even backed the idea directly. An amendment to the Federal Housing Act in the 1930s opened up insured loans of up to $2,000, specifically for adding features like laundry chutes to older homes, right alongside coal chutes, built-in cupboards, and broom closets. That single law pushed the chute into thousands of houses that never had one originally, turning what started as an upper-class extra into something close to a basic expectation. By the 1940s and into the 1950s, your chute had settled into what turned out to be its best years. Post-war suburbs were filling up fast with ranch houses and split levels built with finished basements underneath. Exactly the layout that made a chute genuinely useful instead of just decorative. The culture of that era treated household efficiency as almost a moral virtue, something worth showing off. And a chute fit right into that picture, presented in ads and home magazines as one more small tool keeping a modern household running like a smoothly oiled machine. It was only a few years past that peak when the slow decline began, and it started so quietly that almost nobody noticed it happening in real time. People who study American home design point to the middle of the 1960s as the moment the chute's popularity genuinely started slipping, even while plenty of houses built that same decade still had one as a matter of course. The bigger cultural shift underneath it had less to do with laundry itself and more to do with how the whole idea of household efficiency was losing its grip on how new homes got designed and sold. What had once felt essential slowly stopped being treated as something worth building at all. The 1970s finished what the 1960s had quietly started, and for reasons that had nothing to do with laundry either. Construction costs climbed fast that decade, and builders responded the way builders always do when money gets tight, by cutting anything not considered strictly necessary. A chute took up wall space, needed careful framing, and added a cost that most buyers would never even notice missing. Houses built in the 1970s were not dramatically smaller than the ones built 10 years earlier, just simpler, with fewer of the small extras, and your chute was exactly the kind of small extra that quietly vanished from one blueprint after another. A second, slower force was working against it at the same time, tied directly to where the washer and dryer actually sat inside a house. For most of the century, they belonged in the basement, which is exactly what made a chute running down from the upper floors so useful in the first place. But as washing machines got smaller, quieter, and cheaper, families started moving them out of the basement entirely, into a laundry room upstairs, a closet near the bedrooms, sometimes right in the hallway outside your own room. Once the washer sat on the same floor as the bedrooms it served, the whole reason for a chute connecting that floor to the basement disappeared. There was nowhere useful left for the clothes to travel to. Even in homes that kept the laundry downstairs, a quiet discomfort with the chute itself started working against it. Older wooden chutes, many of them decades old by then, simply did not hold up the way newer materials could. People in the industry point out that wood chutes have a shorter lifespan than modern stainless steel versions, and by the later decades of the century, plenty of them no longer met safety standards that had not even existed when they were first built. Worries about fire safety made this worse, since an open shaft running through several floors could carry smoke and flame far faster than a normally sealed wall ever would. Once a family pulled an old chute out for exactly that reason, there was rarely much reason to put a new one back in. The opening got patched, the wall got sealed, and whatever space it once took up usually turned into a shelf inside a closet. Here is the strange part. American houses did not get smaller during the years the chute disappeared. They got a lot bigger. The average size of a new single-family home climbed from around 1,600 square feet in the mid-1970s to well past 2,500 by the early 2020s. In theory, that growth should have made a chute more useful than ever, since a bigger house meant a longer walk to wherever the laundry sat. Instead, the opposite happened. Builders and homeowners simply stopped treating that long walk as a real enough problem to justify cutting a shaft through multiple floors. Convenience got redefined, quietly, from something that carried your clothes automatically into something that just put the laundry room somewhere closer to begin with. What is left of the laundry chute today mostly survives in older houses nobody has fully modernized, tucked behind a bathroom door, or hiding inside what is now a spice cabinet or a shelf for spare towels. Renovate a house from the 1940s or 1950s, and you might find the outline of an old chute sealed behind the drywall, a narrow gap running down through the wall with no obvious explanation, until someone older in the family remembers exactly what it used to be for. A few newer builders have tried reviving the idea using enclosed systems that pull the laundry along with suction instead of gravity, but that remains a rare novelty rather than anything close to the standard it once was. At its best, your old chute represented a house built around the idea that a chore should take as little thought and effort as possible, solved once through clever design instead of repeated every single day by hand. It needed no motor, no switch, nothing beyond a simple hinge, and the same force that has always pulled things downward. And it worked so well, so quietly, that you grew up dropping your dirty socks into a wall without ever once stopping to think how strange that really was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That chute in your wall once carried your whole laundry pile down to the basement without you ever lifting a hamper. Next, a different feature folded away completely out of sight, waiting quietly inside its own cabinet until it was needed again. Section 3. The fold-down ironing board. You probably never thought twice about the narrow cabinet in your kitchen wall, the one just a little taller than the others, until the day someone showed you what was actually hiding behind its door. Pull the small lever, and a flat wooden board dropped down at an angle, already covered in worn cotton padding, ready for you to stand in front of and start pressing shirts without ever dragging a bulky standing board out of some closet first. When you were finished, you folded it right back up into the wall, and the whole thing disappeared again like it was never there at all. The idea of ironing on a proper flat surface was not new even by the time your grandparents were born. As early as 1858, two inventors named Vandenberg and Harvey patented an ironing table built specifically to make pressing sleeves and pant legs easier than doing it on a kitchen table balanced between two chairs, which is how most households had gotten by for generations before that. A real folding version came along in 1875, patented in Canada by a man named John Porter, and it included its own small removable pressboard just for sleeves. Then in 1892, A woman named Sarah Boone, born to enslaved parents in North Carolina, patented her own improvement to the ironing board, giving it the narrow, curved shape that let a person iron the inside of a sleeve or a fitted bodice without leaving creases in exactly the places that mattered most. That curved shape became the template almost every ironing board since has followed in some form. What your kitchen actually had, tucked behind that narrow cabinet door, came a little later, born out of the same domestic efficiency movement that gave your house its milk door and its laundry chute. Builders started sinking these boards directly into wall cavities and kitchen cabinetry during the 1920s, patenting the mechanisms that let a full-sized board fold flat and disappear into a space barely deep enough to hold a stack of dinner plates. It fit right alongside other space-saving obsessions of that same decade: Murphy beds that vanished into the wall, phone nooks tucked into hallway corners. All of it built on the same basic idea that a modern, well-run house should hide its tools until the exact moment they were needed. For families ironing clothes constantly through the 1920s, 1930s, and on into the 1940s, a board like this solved a real, everyday problem. Cotton and linen wrinkled easily and often, which meant ironing was not some occasional chore, but something that happened almost daily in a house with children, work shirts, and church clothes to keep pressed. A standing board took up real space once it was set up, and it was awkward to store once you were done, leaning against a wall or crammed into a closet where it could tip over and get in everyone's way. A board that folded flat into its own cabinet solved both problems at once. You pulled it down, you ironed, you pushed it back up, and the kitchen looked exactly the way it had before you started. By the time your own house was built in the post-war years, this feature had become common enough that entire catalogs, including the Sears Home Catalog, sold ready-made cabinet units built specifically to house one, sometimes advertised alongside a matching folding serving table that used the very same cabinet space. Builders across the country kept installing them into the 1950s and well into the 1960s, treating the fold-down board as a small, sensible convenience rather than anything special, the same way they treated a broom closet or a linen cupboard. What ended up pulling the rug out from under this feature had almost nothing to do with the board itself, and everything to do with what was happening to the clothes people were putting on it. Chemists working through the middle of the 20th century developed what came to be known as permanent press fabric, a blend of wrinkle-resistant polyester combined with cotton that held its shape through the wash and the dryer without ever needing a hot iron run over it at all. As that fabric spread through everyday wardrobes over the following decades, families found themselves ironing less and less often, not because they had lost interest in looking neat, but because their clothes simply did not need it the way clothes once had. At the same time, everyday dress itself was loosening up. The formal buttoned-up expectations that had defined how people dressed for work, school, and even a trip to the store were slowly giving way to something far more casual, and casual clothes tended to be exactly the kind that never got near an iron in the first place. Once ironing stopped being a near-daily task, the fold-down board stopped earning its place inside the wall. A cabinet that had once justified its own dedicated space in a busy kitchen slowly turned into dead weight, a narrow slot doing nothing useful, while the rest of the house kept changing around it. Homeowners did not usually rip these cabinets out entirely. It was easier, and cheaper, to simply leave the board folded up inside and turn the empty space in front of it into something else. One homeowner who eventually restored an ironing board built into a 1920s kitchen found that a previous family living in the same house had converted the whole cabinet into a spice rack sometime around the 1960s, apparently deciding there was simply too much going on in daily life by then to bother pulling out an iron very often. That kind of quiet repurposing happened in houses across the country, board after board getting folded up one final time and never dropped down again, while the cabinet in front of it filled up with something else entirely. A fold-down board that survived intact into the present usually did so purely by accident, protected inside a house that never got remodeled, rather than through any deliberate choice to keep it. Pull open one of these old cabinets today, in a house that has kept its original bones, and there is a real chance the board still works exactly the way it did the day it was installed. Hinges a little stiff, the padding faded and thin, but the mechanism itself still perfectly sound. It never broke, it never wore out. It simply stopped being needed, one permanent press shirt at a time, until an entire feature that had once seemed like a small stroke of genius quietly turned into the kind of thing nobody thought to explain to the next generation living in the house. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That narrow cabinet in your kitchen once hid an entire chore behind a single folding door, gone the moment you pushed it shut. Next, a different kind of built-in feature kept an entire wall of your house cool during the hottest nights of summer, long before anyone in your family ever turned on central air. Section 4. The whole house attic fan. You remember the sound before you remember anything else about it. A low, steady roar coming from somewhere above the hallway ceiling, loud enough that you had to raise your voice a little to be heard over it. But somehow it was also the sound that meant the whole house was finally about to cool down. Your parents would crack a few windows on the lower floor, flip one switch, and within minutes the entire house filled with moving air, pulled in from outside and pushed straight up through the attic and out through the roof vents. Nobody called it complicated. It was just the fan, and every summer night that mattered, it ran. The basic idea behind it went back further than your parents did. The first electric fan was invented in 1882, and it did not take long for people to realize a large enough fan, mounted in the right place, could move air through an entire house instead of just one room. Whole house fans in some early form existed by the early 1900s, decades before air conditioning had any real presence in ordinary homes at all, since the technology Willis Carrier had invented in 1907 stayed mostly confined to factories, theaters, and office buildings for years after it first appeared. For a family in the first half of the century, moving air was really the only tool available against summer heat, and a fan built into the ceiling between the living space and the attic did that job better than any window unit sitting in a single room ever could. The real golden age for this fan arrived exactly when you were growing up, through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Central air conditioning existed by then, and window units had already started showing up in some homes, especially after the war economy left families with more spare income than they had ever had before. But both options cost real money to buy and real money to run every single month. A whole house fan, by comparison, was cheap to install and cheap to operate, pulling only a fraction of the electricity a compressor-driven air conditioner needed to do a comparable job. For families across the South and through much of the rest of the country, that price difference mattered enough that the fan became the obvious choice, especially in regions where the nights cooled down reliably, even after a brutal, humid afternoon. Flip the switch once the sun went down. Let the fan pull that cooler night air through every open window in the house, and by morning the whole place felt livable again, without a single dollar spent on refrigerant or a compressor. The way it worked was almost embarrassingly simple once you understood it, and it is worth walking through slowly, because most people who grew up with one never actually thought about the mechanics behind the noise. Mounted in the ceiling, usually in a central hallway, the fan pulled hot air straight up out of the living space and pushed it into the attic, where it escaped through vents built into the roof or the gable ends. That single motion created a drop in pressure throughout the rest of the house, and that drop pulled cooler air in from outside through whatever windows had been left cracked open on the lower floors. No refrigerant, no compressor, no complicated ductwork snaking through the walls. Just one motor and a very large blade doing the work that an entire air conditioning system would otherwise need to handle. Some houses had the fan mounted directly into the ceiling itself, right where the hallway met the attic hatch, while others used a version set farther back among the rafters and connected by ductwork, which tended to run a little quieter than the ceiling-mounted kind your family probably grew up with. A few homes, especially smaller ones without a proper attic to vent into, used a version mounted straight into a window frame instead, doing roughly the same job from a different angle. It is worth being clear about one thing this fan was never meant to do, since people sometimes confuse it with a smaller, more limited cousin. A powered attic ventilator, the kind of fan some houses had bolted into the roof or a gable vent, only pulled hot air out of the empty attic space itself, keeping the insulation and rafters from baking under a hot roof all summer. It never touched the living space below at all. The whole house fan your family actually used did something bigger, pulling air out of the rooms you were standing in and using the attic purely as an exhaust route on the way outside. Confusing the two led plenty of people over the years to assume their roof vent fan should be cooling the house, when it was only ever protecting the attic itself. It was not without its downsides, and you probably remember at least a few of them without needing anyone to point them out. The fan was loud enough that a conversation in the next room sometimes had to wait until it clicked off, and that noise stayed one of the most common complaints people had about the whole system for as long as it remained in common use. It created a genuine draft strong enough that a stack of loose papers left on a table could scatter clear across a room, and if the weather outside happened to be humid rather than dry, the fan mostly just moved that same humid air around instead of actually cooling anything down in a way that felt satisfying. In parts of the country where humidity stayed high overnight, even after the sun went down, some families paired their fan with a separate evaporative cooler, an older, low-cost cooling method that worked by passing air over water to bring the temperature down before it ever got pulled through the house. None of that mattered much as long as the alternative, buying and running a full air conditioning system, remained expensive enough that most families simply lived with the noise and the occasional gust of wind through the hallway. What eventually ended the whole house fan's reign had nothing to do with any flaw in the fan itself. Central air conditioning kept getting cheaper and more reliable through the 1960s, helped along by a country that was also shifting where its population actually lived, with more families than ever moving into warmer regions across the Sun Belt where reliable cooling stopped being a luxury and started being close to a basic requirement for daily life. By the 1970s, close to half of all American homes had some form of air conditioning installed, a number that would have seemed almost unbelievable to a family relying on nothing but a ceiling fan and open windows just 20 years earlier. Air conditioning offered something the fan structurally could not: precise, consistent temperature control, regardless of what the weather happened to be doing outside that particular night. It did not care whether the humidity was high or low. It did not need a family to remember to crack the right windows before going to bed, or to guess how many to open and by how much. You simply set a number, and the house held to it, hour after hour, without anyone thinking about it again. As central air spread through new construction and retrofit projects alike, the whole house fan quietly stopped being something builders included as a matter of course. Homes built from the 1970s onward increasingly came with central air already installed from day one, which made a second, separate cooling system built into the attic feel redundant rather than essential. In houses that already had a fan installed, many families kept it running for years anyway, since it still worked exactly as well as it always had on the kind of mild spring or fall evening, where running a full air conditioner felt like overkill for the amount of actual cooling needed. But newer generations moving into those same houses, or building new ones altogether, increasingly skipped the fan entirely, treating central air as the default, and the attic fan as a strange, noisy leftover feature nobody bothered explaining to them when they moved in. Plenty of these fans simply sat unused for years, their switches gathering dust on a hallway wall, until a family finally pulled the whole unit out during a renovation without ever having flipped it on even once. The fan did not disappear from the market entirely, and it eventually found its way back into a small but genuine niche. In 1999, an electrical contractor named Dana Stevenson was installing one of the old traditional-style whole-house fans for a customer when he became convinced the design could be improved dramatically, particularly on the one complaint that had followed the fan since the 1950s: its noise. What followed was a new generation of far quieter models, engineered specifically to solve the exact problem that had pushed so many families towards central air in the first place, giving homeowners the choice between a quiet, expensive air conditioner and a loud, cheap fan, without forcing them to actually pick one or the other. Modern versions marketed under names built around exactly that promise now run close to silently, a genuine improvement over the fans your family grew up hearing through the ceiling every summer night. Even with those improvements, the whole house fan today survives as a deliberate, informed choice rather than the automatic default it once was for an entire generation of American households. It tends to show up now in drier climates where the temperature still drops meaningfully after dark, installed by homeowners who specifically want a lower-cost, lower-impact alternative to running a compressor all night, rather than in the ordinary tract houses where it once came standard, without anyone giving it a second thought. For most of the country, central air simply took over the job so completely that an entire feature which once defined how millions of families survived a hot summer night quietly faded into something closer to a curiosity, remembered mostly by people old enough to recall exactly what that low, steady roar sounded like coming down the hallway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That fan once cooled your whole house using nothing but open windows and a single motor in the attic. Next, a different feature lined an entire closet in fragrant wood, quietly protecting your family's clothes from a problem most houses do not even think about anymore: Section 5. The cedar closet. That little closet at the end of the hallway always smelled different from every other closet in the house, and nobody ever explained why. It was smaller than the others, sometimes barely wide enough to hang a winter coat, but every single time you opened it, that same sharp, woodsy smell hit you before you even looked inside. Your mother called it the cedar closet, and she stored the good coats there, the wool sweaters, anything she cared enough about to protect through a long, humid summer, while nobody was wearing it. The idea behind lining a closet in cedar was old enough that it predates your grandparents by thousands of years. Homer himself referred to a cedar-lined chest holding King Priam's treasures in the Iliad, and the basic instinct behind it, that cedar wood somehow kept insects away from stored fabric, had been passed down through households for centuries without anyone fully understanding why it actually worked. It was not until the 1920s and 1930s that scientists finally studied the chemistry behind that old habit seriously, discovering that cedar oils contain compounds called sesquiterpene hydrocarbons, the same chemicals responsible for that distinctive, resinous, almost camphor-like scent every cedar closet carried. Some species of cedar hold these compounds at concentrations reaching close to 70% of the oil inside the wood itself, which is a large part of why the smell hits so strongly the moment a closet door swings open. What that scent was actually protecting against was one very specific, very persistent household pest, the common clothes moth, whose larvae fed on natural fibers like wool, feathers, and silk, chewing small, ragged holes straight through a sweater or a coat left sitting untouched for months at a time. For a family in the middle of the 20th century, this was a real and recurring problem, since wool made up a much larger share of the average wardrobe back then than it does now, and a favorite winter coat left hanging all summer in an ordinary closet stood a genuine chance of coming out ruined by the time the weather turned cold again. A cedar-lined closet gave a family a place to store exactly those vulnerable items with real confidence, built directly into the house rather than treated as some separate piece of furniture that had to be bought and squeezed in somewhere. Builders through the 1920s, 1930s, and on into the post-war decades treated a cedar closet as a genuinely upscale feature, something that signaled a household had the means to build in a dedicated space purely for protecting clothing that was not even being worn at the moment. It usually amounted to a single small closet, sometimes no larger than a narrow linen cupboard, with the interior walls and shelving built entirely out of aromatic cedar planks instead of ordinary drywall or plain wood. That small footprint was part of the appeal. A family did not need to dedicate an entire room to the idea. One well-built cedar closet, tucked at the end of a hallway or inside a larger walk-in closet, was enough to protect a household's most valuable wool coats and sweaters through an entire off-season. The alternative most families reached for, when they did not have a proper cedar closet, was considerably less pleasant and considerably more dangerous than anyone fully appreciated at the time. Mothballs, made from a chemical called paradichlorobenzene, or an older compound called naphthalene, worked by releasing a poisonous gas that could kill moth larvae, but only if the clothing was sealed tightly enough inside a bag or a box for that gas to actually build up to a lethal concentration. An ordinary closet door, even closed, rarely sealed well enough to make mothballs fully effective against moths, which meant a lot of families spent decades filling their closets with a smell most people found nearly unbearable, in exchange for protection that was often only partial at best. Worse, both of the chemicals used in mothballs carried real health risks for the people living in the house, not just the moths they were meant to kill, with naphthalene linked to lung and blood problems from long-term exposure, and paradichlorobenzene classified as a substance dangerous enough that regulators eventually restricted its use in a number of countries. Cedar never carried any of those same health risks, which is a large part of why it held its reputation as the safer, gentler solution for so long, even as scientists later discovered its actual moth-repelling power was more limited than most people assumed at the time. The oils responsible for that distinctive scent fade out of the wood gradually over just a few years, which meant an older cedar closet, one that had been built decades earlier and never refinished, could smell almost nothing like cedar at all anymore despite still being called by that name. A family sanding down the walls of an old cedar closet, or simply rubbing the surface with a cloth, could refresh that scent and restore at least some of its original strength. But plenty of households never thought to do this kind of maintenance, and the protection those closets offered slowly weakened without anyone in the house realizing it. What eventually pulled cedar closets out of new home construction had almost nothing to do with cedar itself losing its effectiveness. It had to do with what people were actually putting inside their closets, changing completely. Starting in the middle of the 20th century and accelerating through the decades that followed, synthetic fibers like polyester, nylon, acrylic, and rayon spread rapidly through everyday American wardrobes, either replacing wool outright or blended into it at just a small percentage. Clothes moths, it turned out, had no interest in eating synthetic fiber at all, and even blending a small amount of synthetic material into an otherwise natural fabric was often enough to make an entire garment unappealing to the insects that had once threatened it. As wool became a smaller and smaller share of what an ordinary family actually owned, the specific threat a cedar closet had been built to guard against simply mattered less with every passing year. By the time your own house was being built, in the 1960s, that shift was already well underway, even if wool had not disappeared from closets entirely. Builders still occasionally included a cedar-lined closet as an upscale touch in higher-end homes, but it had stopped being treated as a near-essential feature the way it had been decades earlier. Families who already had one in an older house tended to keep using it out of habit more than urgent necessity, storing coats and sweaters there simply because that closet had always been where the good clothes went, whether or not moths were still the genuine threat they had once been. Over the following decades, as synthetic fabric took over even more completely, and central heating made homes drier and less hospitable to moths in general, the cedar closet slowly slipped from a practical necessity into something closer to a pleasant, old-fashioned habit, a nice smell in the hallway, rather than a serious line of defense against anything. What survives of the cedar closet today mostly lives on in exactly that reduced form, a fading tradition rather than a genuine necessity. Newer homes rarely include one at all, and the cedar products still sold for closets today, cedar blocks, hangers, and small cedar-lined boxes, are marketed honestly as a mild deterrent, rather than any kind of guaranteed protection, since even manufacturers now openly acknowledge that cedar alone cannot eliminate an active infestation once moths have already taken hold. For anyone who grew up with a real cedar closet at the end of the hallway, the smell itself often outlasts every practical reason it was ever built in the first place. A small, woodsy memory of a house that once quietly protected its best clothes, with nothing more than the natural oils sitting inside a plank of wood. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That small closet once protected your family's best clothes using nothing but the natural scent of its own walls. Next, a different feature carried food straight down through the floors of the house, moving trays and dishes between levels without a single person having to climb a set of stairs. Section 6. The dumbwaiter. The little door in your kitchen wall belonged to something bigger, though nobody ever told you that outright. It sat close to knee height, small enough that you had to crouch down to see inside, and behind it was a narrow wooden platform hanging on a rope, disappearing straight up into a dark shaft. Your grandmother might have called it the dumbwaiter, and if your family still had one working, you probably used it more like a toy than a tool, sending a note or a snack up to a sibling's room and pulling the rope yourself to watch it climb. The idea behind it is far older than anyone in your family, older than the house itself, older than the country. The very first recorded description of something like it comes from around 200 BC, when a Roman architect wrote about installing a lift specifically to move goods between the floors of a building, long before anyone called it a dumbwaiter at all. The idea resurfaced centuries later in a much stranger form inside the palace of King Louis XV of France, sometime around the 1750s, where an entire section of the dining room floor was designed to open up and lower a fully set table down to the kitchen below, only to rise back up minutes later loaded with the next course. All so the king could dine without any servant standing in the room to overhear him. Thomas Jefferson is often credited with bringing the idea to America after seeing something similar during his years in France, and it eventually made its way into the grand homes of the wealthy, where it earned the name that stuck, the dumbwaiter, a nod to the fact that the lift itself never spoke and never needed to. For a long stretch of the 19th century, that was exactly who owned one. Dumbwaiters lived almost exclusively in the mansions of rich families and in restaurants and hotels wealthy enough to build multiple floors into their kitchens, moving food, dishes, and drinks up and down a shaft using nothing more than a rope threaded through a simple pulley. Someone still had to pull that rope by hand, hauling the loaded platform up one floor at a time, which meant even the earliest dumbwaiters still required real physical effort from whoever was operating them, usually a servant working just out of sight in a back hallway, or a narrow service stairwell built specifically so the family upstairs never had to watch the labor happening behind their walls. The first real patent for the modern dumbwaiter came from an American inventor named George Cannon in 1887, and it was not long after that when restaurant owners in particular started running into a new problem entirely. Dumbwaiters in busy kitchens got used constantly, hour after hour during a dinner rush, and all that repeated use put enormous strain on the ropes and pulleys holding the whole system together. Ropes stretched, they slipped off worn pulleys. Loads shifted and spilled halfway up the shaft, sending soup or china crashing down into the kitchen below. Engineers spent the years around the turn of the century working out safer designs, adding features like slack cables that pulled taut automatically if the main line ever failed, a safeguard meant to keep a loaded platform from simply dropping through the shaft if something snapped. The real transformation came in the 1920s, when electric motors finally reached the dumbwaiter, the same decade that was busy electrifying nearly every other convenience inside the American home. An electric dumbwaiter did not need anyone standing at the bottom hauling a rope by hand. A person could load the platform, press a button, and let the motor carry everything up on its own, arriving at the right floor with far less risk of a slipped load or a frayed rope giving way mid-trip. That single change pushed the dumbwaiter out of exclusively wealthy homes and into a much wider range of buildings. Libraries started installing them to move requested books between floors and the circulation desk, a system some university libraries relied on well into the 20th century, since undergraduate students at certain schools were not even allowed to browse the stacks directly and had to wait for a librarian to send their requested book down by dumbwaiter instead. Restaurants leaned on them even more heavily than before, and apartment buildings in growing cities began installing dumbwaiters specifically so residents could send laundry and groceries between floors without hauling everything up a crowded stairwell themselves. By the time your own house may have had one built in, sometime in the first half of the 20th century, the dumbwaiter had settled into a fairly specific role inside an ordinary American home. It rarely served formal dinners the way it once had in a Gilded Age mansion. Instead, it usually connected an upstairs bedroom hallway to the kitchen or the laundry area below, giving a family a simple, low-effort way to move laundry baskets, dishes, or firewood between floors without anyone needing to carry a heavy load up or down a full staircase. Building codes in a number of cities began requiring these shafts to be built with fireproof walls and self-closing doors, treating even a small residential dumbwaiter as a real structural feature that needed the same fire safety consideration as any other opening cut through multiple floors of a house. What eventually pushed the dumbwaiter out of new home construction was not any single dramatic failure, but a slow accumulation of smaller shifts in how houses themselves were designed and staffed. Domestic servants, once a normal part of upper and even solid middle-class households, became far less common through the middle decades of the 20th century, and a device originally built to let household staff move goods discreetly between floors made a lot less sense in a home where no live-in staff existed to operate it in the first place. At the same time, washing machines and dryers were increasingly installed directly on the same floor as the bedrooms they served, doing to the dumbwaiter exactly what it had already done to the laundry chute a few decades earlier, removing the very reason anyone needed to move anything between floors at all. Smaller post-war houses, built without a full basement kitchen or a distinct servants' area, simply did not have the same layout that had once made a dumbwaiter a natural fit. Builders through the middle of the century increasingly left the dumbwaiter out of new houses altogether, treating it the way they treated the built-in ironing board and the milk door, a small extra that added real construction cost for a convenience fewer and fewer families genuinely needed. Existing dumbwaiters in older houses mostly just stopped getting used, their shafts left standing empty and dark behind a small door that eventually got painted shut or covered over during some later renovation. The same quiet fate that met so many of these built-in features once the specific problem they solved simply stopped being a problem anyone still had. A small revival has crept back into some multi-level townhouses and larger, newer homes in recent years, marketed now less as a servant's tool and more as a practical way to avoid hauling laundry or groceries up several flights of stairs in a tall, narrow, modern house. But that revival remains a niche choice for buyers willing to pay extra for it. Nothing close to the ordinary, expected feature the dumbwaiter briefly became during its middle years, when an electric motor and a shrinking household staff turned an old symbol of wealth into something almost any well-built American house might reasonably have tucked behind a small door in its kitchen wall. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That small door once carried your family's laundry and dishes silently between floors, without anyone climbing a single stair. Next, a different feature sat quietly in a corner of the living room, holding the entire household's phone conversations in a space built for exactly that purpose alone. Section 7. The telephone nook. Somewhere in your childhood house, the phone lived in exactly one place, and one place only. It sat in a small carved-out corner of the hallway, sometimes with a narrow shelf just wide enough to hold the receiver and a scrap of paper, sometimes with its own tiny stool tucked underneath, so whoever was talking could actually sit down. The very idea of a house needing a designated space for its telephone only made sense once telephones themselves became common enough that a family owned one at all, and that took considerably longer to happen than most people realize. The invention of the telephone itself came down to an extraordinarily close race between multiple competing inventors working on similar ideas at nearly the same time. On February 14, 1876, both Alexander Graham Bell and a rival inventor named Elisha Gray showed up at the same patent office in Washington within hours of each other, each one carrying a version of essentially the same device, with Bell filing his application about 2 hours before Gray filed his own competing paperwork on a comparable invention. That narrow margin of a few hours ended up deciding who history would remember as the telephone's inventor, even though several other engineers working independently around the world, including Antonio Meucci, Innocenzo Manzetti, and Johann Philipp Reis, had all been experimenting with strikingly similar ideas around roughly the same period, each arriving at some version of the same basic breakthrough, almost by coincidence. It took decades for that invention to spread from a novelty demonstrated in laboratories into something an ordinary family actually owned and used every day. By 1948, the 30 millionth telephone line had finally been connected across the United States, and growth from there accelerated fast enough that by the 1960s, the country had passed 80 million phone hookups, with roughly 160 million connected worldwide by that same point. That number kept climbing until it crossed 175 million lines in the United States alone by 1980. For most of that growth period, though, a household phone was not something every single member of a family had their own private access to the way people expect today. A house typically had exactly one telephone, wired to exactly one jack in exactly one location, and that single phone had to serve every person living under that roof, from the parents making an important call to the kids fighting over who got to talk to a friend first. That single phone problem is precisely what gave rise to the built-in telephone nook in the first place. Builders working through the 1920s started designing small, dedicated alcoves directly into the walls of new houses, usually positioned in a hallway between the bedrooms and the main bathroom, a location central enough that anyone in the house could reach it quickly, no matter which room they happened to be in at the time. These nooks were often shallow, sometimes barely deeper than the phone itself, with a small shelf built for the receiver and a lower compartment specifically designed to house the ringer box, the separate mechanical unit that produced the actual ringing sound before that hardware eventually got integrated directly into the phone housing itself later on. Families who could not justify a fully built-in nook, or whose homes had not been built with one, often bought a freestanding version of the same idea instead, a telephone table or stand, typically placed in that same central hallway for the exact same reason, offering a small seat or stool attached to a narrow table, with a shelf built specifically to hold the phone steady while someone talked. Most of these tables were fairly simple. Plain wood construction meant purely for function rather than appearance, though some fancier versions turned up in wealthier homes, built from bronze with marble tops or carved in elaborate styles that borrowed directly from Italian Renaissance furniture design. A strange amount of decorative attention paid to what was, at its core, just a small table for a telephone that anyone in the house might need to use at any given moment. Placing the phone in one shared central location was not simply a matter of space efficiency or clever design. It reflected exactly how a household actually used the device during those decades, and it shaped a set of habits that never needed explaining to anyone growing up inside them. A phone call was treated as a shared household resource, something one person used at a time, while everyone else waited their turn or worked around whoever happened to be talking at that moment. The location itself, out in the open hallway rather than tucked inside a private bedroom, meant a phone call in your childhood house was rarely a fully private event either, since anyone walking past could hear at least half the conversation whether they meant to or not. Catching one side of an argument or a piece of gossip just by passing through on the way to the bathroom. That lack of privacy became even more pronounced for families living on what phone companies called a party line, an arrangement common through the middle of the 20th century, especially in rural areas, where a single telephone line was shared among two or more separate households, rather than dedicated to just one home, as a way of keeping the cost of running cable down in less densely populated regions. Picking up your own receiver on a party line meant there was a real chance you would hear a neighbor already mid-conversation, and picking up specifically to listen in on somebody else's call, deliberately or not, became such a routine, semi-accepted habit in some communities during the 1950s and 1960s that people later remembered it fondly as a genuine source of entertainment, competing directly with television for attention on a slow evening at home. Everyone on the line generally knew everyone else's business. For better or worse, long before anyone worried seriously about a government listening in on a private call, since neighbors sharing a party line were already doing exactly that to each other as a matter of ordinary, everyday routine. Because the phone occupied one fixed shared spot in the house, the physical space around it developed its own set of small, unwritten household customs that shaped daily life without anyone ever writing them down or explaining them out loud. You knew to keep a call reasonably short if someone else in the family was waiting nearby, tapping a foot, or hovering just out of sight in the hallway, clearly annoyed but too polite to actually interrupt. You knew certain conversations, the kind you did not want your parents or siblings overhearing even partially, either needed to wait for an empty house or get handled in a hushed, careful tone with one hand cupped tightly around the receiver, hoping the sound would not carry any farther than it absolutely had to. The Nook itself, small and unremarkable as it looked sitting quietly in the hallway, ended up shaping an entire generation's basic etiquette around a technology that, at the time, felt like the single fastest and most exciting way to reach someone who was not standing directly in front of you. What eventually made the telephone Nook obsolete had almost nothing to do with any flaw in the Nook itself, and everything to do with how many phones an ordinary house eventually needed to have scattered across its rooms. Telephone companies gradually made it easier and more affordable for households to add extension phones throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Extra handsets wired into additional rooms, so a family no longer had to funnel every single call through one shared hallway location, no matter how inconvenient the timing happened to be. A phone in the kitchen meant someone cooking dinner did not have to abandon a boiling pot on the stove just to answer a ring coming from down the hall. A phone in a parent's bedroom meant a late-night call did not require stumbling through a dark house half asleep, feeling along the wall for the light switch. As more of these extensions spread through American homes over the following years, the single, centralized Nook slowly lost the one thing that had justified its existence in the first place, being the only spot in the entire house where a phone call could actually happen at all. Party lines themselves also began disappearing steadily through this same stretch of decades, as telephone companies invested heavily in expanding their networks and offering private, single-household lines, even in areas that had once relied on shared service purely as a way to save money on running separate cable to every individual home. As more families gained access to a private line of their own, the specific social pressure that had once made the hallway phone feel like a genuinely shared, almost semi-public household resource started to fade away as well. A phone call increasingly became something an individual person handled entirely on their own terms, in whatever room happened to be convenient at that particular moment, rather than a shared event the entire household had unconsciously organized itself around for years, without ever really questioning why. Builders responded to these shifts the same way they had responded to the milk door and the built-in ironing board before it, by simply stopping. New houses built from the 1960s onward increasingly skipped the dedicated telephone Nook altogether, wiring jacks into multiple rooms from the very start of construction, and leaving families to decide for themselves where each individual phone should actually end up sitting. Existing Nooks in older houses did not usually get removed outright, since ripping one out required real demolition work for very little practical gain in return. Instead, they slowly got repurposed into something else entirely over the years. A small shelf for keys and mail sitting near the front door, a spot for a decorative plant nobody thought much about, or simply an empty alcove nobody in the house quite knew what to do with anymore. The same fate that met so many small built-in features once the specific arrangement of household life that had originally called for them quietly stopped existing in any meaningful way. Anyone who grew up with one of these Nooks, still intact in an older house today, usually recognizes it immediately for exactly what it once was, even if there has not been a corded phone sitting inside it for decades, and even if the children living in that house now have no idea what the strange little alcove was ever meant to hold. It survives now mostly as a small architectural fingerprint, left behind by a very particular era of household life. One where an entire family shared a single telephone, a single line running into the house, and often a single hallway conversation. Everyone else living there could partially overhear whether they wanted to or not, standing quietly in the background of dinner preparations and homework, and everything else that filled up an ordinary evening at home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That small alcove once held your entire family's only connection to the outside world in one shared corner of the hallway. Next, a different feature hid inside the kitchen wall, quietly keeping flour, sugar, and fresh bread cool and protected without ever needing a refrigerator at all. Section 8. The built-in flour bin and sifter. Your grandmother talked about her Hoosier the way some people talk about a car or a favorite chair, like it was practically a member of the family. It stood taller than you did as a kid, a tall wooden cabinet with an upper section full of small compartments and a wide, flat work surface at waist height where she rolled out dough and mixed batter. The whole idea behind it grew out of a kitchen problem that sounds almost unimaginable today. Before the 1920s, most American kitchens simply did not have the built-in cabinetry and countertops that later became standard in nearly every home. A cook working in a kitchen from that earlier period had to make do with whatever combination of freestanding furniture she could gather. A wash basin here, an icebox there, a plain wooden table somewhere in the middle, none of it designed to work together as a single coordinated system. Baking from scratch, which was simply how nearly all baking got done in that era, meant constantly gathering ingredients and tools scattered across a kitchen that had never been organized around the actual steps of cooking a meal. A company in Newcastle, Indiana, incorporated in 1899 under the name Hoosier Manufacturing, set out to solve exactly that problem by rethinking an older piece of furniture called a baker's cabinet and packing it full of new features nobody had combined into one unit quite that way before. The idea caught on so quickly that other companies rushed to copy it almost immediately, most notably a rival firm called Sellers & Sons, out of Elwood, Indiana, along with names like McDougall, KitchenMaid, Napanee, and Wilson, each one selling its own version of essentially the same concept. Because so many of these competing manufacturers happened to be based in Indiana, the entire category of cabinet eventually just became known by the state's nickname, regardless of which specific company had actually built any individual piece sitting in someone's kitchen. What made these cabinets genuinely different from an ordinary cupboard was how much thought had gone into fitting real, specific kitchen tasks into a single compact footprint. The upper section typically held a built-in bin for flour, often with a glass front so a cook could see the level inside without opening anything, paired with the crank-operated sifter mounted right underneath it. Turn that crank, and a rotating mechanism inside pushed the flour through a fine mesh screen, aerating it and filtering out any lumps. And in the years before packaged flour was reliably clean, filtering out the occasional insect as well, letting it fall in a soft, even stream straight down into whatever bowl was waiting below. A similar, smaller bin usually handled sugar the same way. Beyond the two staple bins, a well-equipped Hoosier included a rack of specially fitted glass jars for spices, sometimes described by manufacturers as ant-proof, along with canisters for coffee and tea, a dedicated metal-lined drawer built specifically to keep freshly baked bread and cake fresh, cutlery drawers, and towel storage, all wrapped around a wide, easy-to-clean work surface that started out as plain wood and eventually evolved into enameled metal or aluminum as the design matured through the 1910s and 1920s. For a woman running a kitchen in the early decades of the 20th century, a cabinet like this represented something close to a genuine revolution in how much physical effort a single meal required. Before it, gathering flour, sugar, spices, and a mixing bowl for one batch of biscuits might mean walking to 3 or 4 different spots scattered across the kitchen. With a Hoosier standing in the corner, nearly everything needed for baking sat within arm's reach of a single spot, all of it accessible without bending, searching, or carrying heavy sacks across the room. Manufacturers leaned hard into that promise in their advertising, marketing the cabinets directly to homemakers as a device that saved 1,000 steps, a claim specific enough that it became something close to an informal slogan repeated across print ads for years. That pitch worked. By 1920, the Hoosier Manufacturing Company alone had sold more than 2 million cabinets across the country, and once every competing manufacturer's sales got added into the same total, some estimates suggest roughly 1 in every 3 American households owned some version of one during the cabinet's peak years. Companies also pioneered accessible payment plans to reach as many households as possible, with one 1917 advertisement offering a cabinet for as little as $1 down and $1 a week, spreading the full price, which ranged from around $14 up to just over $50 depending on the model, across payments an ordinary family could actually manage. The cabinet's popularity held strong through the 1920s, and by most estimates, somewhere close to 4 million of these cabinets had been manufactured in total by the time the design's era came to an end. The overwhelming majority of them built in factories scattered across Indiana. Families who bought one tended to keep it for decades, passing it down from a mother to a daughter, the same way they might pass down a piece of good jewelry or a set of china, since the cabinets were built solidly enough, mostly from oak in the earlier years, that a well-cared-for unit could easily outlast the kitchen it was originally purchased for. What eventually ended the cabinet's dominance had almost nothing to do with any flaw in its design, and everything to do with a completely different approach to kitchen construction that started gaining ground through the 1930s and accelerated sharply after the war. The Great Depression hit sales of nearly every consumer good hard, and the Hoosier cabinet was no exception, with orders slowing to a trickle through the early 1930s, as families across the country simply stopped buying new furniture of any kind if they could possibly avoid it. World War II compounded that slump directly, since the materials needed to build a solidly constructed wooden cabinet, along with the metal components used in its bins and hardware, became genuinely scarce as factories and raw materials got redirected toward the war effort instead. By the time the war ended and the economy roared back to life, kitchen design itself had shifted in a direction that made the entire freestanding cabinet concept feel outdated almost overnight. Builders throughout the post-war boom increasingly designed kitchens around built-in cabinetry installed directly into the walls, paired with continuous countertops that ran from one end of the room to the other, an approach that offered considerably more storage and workspace than any single standalone piece of furniture, no matter how cleverly organized, could ever hope to match. A kitchen built this way did not need a large, heavy cabinet sitting in the middle of the floor housing its flour and sugar. That storage was simply part of the wall now, built in from the very start of construction, rather than purchased separately and wheeled into place afterward. The two largest manufacturers most associated with the style did not survive this shift for very long. The Hoosier Manufacturing Company itself was sold off and liquidated in 1942, worn down by the combination of Depression-era sales slumps and wartime material shortages that had already crippled the business well before the post-war building boom finished the job. Its longtime rival, Sellers & Sons, managed to hang on somewhat longer before closing in 1950, but by then the entire style of cabinet the two companies had spent decades competing to sell had already been thoroughly overtaken by the new built-in kitchen standard, sweeping through American home construction. Even in houses where a Hoosier had already been standing for years by the time this shift happened, plenty of families simply kept using theirs well into the post-war decades regardless of what newer homes were being built with instead. Some of the comments people leave today when reminiscing about these cabinets describe exactly that pattern. A Hoosier still standing as the mainstay of a kitchen well into the middle of the 1960s. Its flour bin and sifter still working perfectly fine. Its porcelain top still holding up to daily use, simply because there was no compelling reason to rip out a piece of furniture that continued doing its job well, just because newer houses down the street had switched to something different. For a family that already owned one, replacing a perfectly functional Hoosier with wall-mounted cabinetry meant real expense and real disruption for very little practical gain, and plenty of households across the country quietly kept their cabinets standing in the kitchen corner for years, even decades, after the style itself had stopped being manufactured or sold as anything new. What eventually happened to most of these cabinets, once a family finally did remodel or move on to a different house, followed a familiar pattern by then. Some got sold off or given away entirely, passed along to whoever in the extended family had room for a large, heavy piece of furniture nobody quite needed anymore, but nobody wanted to simply throw out either. Others got repurposed inside the very same house, stripped of their original flour bins, and turned into a bathroom vanity or a garage workbench, their distinctive sifter mechanism removed or simply left to sit unused and forgotten behind a closed door. A number of families held onto theirs purely out of sentiment, keeping a grandmother's old cabinet standing in a den or a spare room long after anyone in the house still baked enough to actually need a built-in flour sifter for daily use. Antique dealers and collectors eventually caught on to exactly what these old cabinets represented, and by the early 2000s, a well-preserved Hoosier, complete with its original accessories, the glass spice jars, the intact flour sifter, the porcelain work surface without a single crack, could sell at auction for well over $1,000, occasionally climbing past $2,000 for a particularly complete oak example, with everything still functioning the way it had when it first left the factory floor. That kind of collector interest turned what had once been dismissed as simply outdated kitchen furniture into a genuinely valued piece of American design history, restored and refinished by people specifically chasing the nostalgia of a kitchen tool that had quietly organized the daily work of millions of households for close to 4 decades before built-in cabinetry made it unnecessary. For anyone who actually grew up watching a grandmother crank that little sifter handle, sending a soft cloud of flour drifting down into a waiting bowl, the memory tends to stick in a way that few other kitchen tools ever quite manage. It represented an entire philosophy about how a kitchen should work. Everything a cook genuinely needed gathered into arm's reach inside one carefully engineered cabinet, solving a real physical problem with clever mechanical design rather than simply adding more square footage to the room. When the built-in kitchen finally arrived and made that single, all-in-one cabinet unnecessary, an entire category of American furniture quietly stepped aside, leaving behind nothing but old advertisements promising to save 1,000 steps and a scattering of surviving cabinets now treasured far more for their nostalgia than for the flour they still could, technically, sift. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That tall cabinet once gathered your grandmother's entire kitchen routine into one compact, carefully organized piece of furniture built specifically around her. Next, a different feature sat sunken right into the floor of your living room, gathering the whole family together in a way no ordinary couch ever quite managed. Section 9. The Conversation Pit. Walking into that living room meant watching the floor simply disappear a few feet in front of you, dropping down into a wide, carpeted well ringed with built-in seating and a coffee table sitting right in the middle of it all. You did not sit on a chair in that room. You stepped down into it. The earliest known version of this idea in America traces back to 1927, when an architect named Bruce Goff designed a home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for his own mentor, building a double-height living room with a semicircular sunken area wrapped around a fireplace. Goff kept returning to the same basic idea throughout his long career, using variations of it in house after house through the 1950s and into the 1960s, though none of his early work got much attention from the architectural press at the time. The concept itself was far older than Goff or anything happening in 20th century America. Sunken gathering spaces built around the same basic instinct, bringing people together at one shared level inside a slightly lowered floor, show up across cultures going back centuries, in ancient Rome, in traditional Chinese and Japanese design, and in medieval Spain, long before anyone in Tulsa ever poured concrete for a fireplace pit. What actually launched the idea into the American mainstream was a single, extraordinarily influential house. In 1952, a wealthy industrialist named J. Irwin Miller and his wife Xenia commissioned a trio of major design talents to build their private residence in Columbus, Indiana, with architect Eero Saarinen handling the structure itself and textile designer Alexander Girard shaping the interior. Finished in 1957, the Miller House featured a short staircase leading down into a sunken living room wrapped by a single, continuous sofa, accessed by 4 steps with no railing at all, deliberately built that way to encourage guests to mingle freely without furniture getting in the way. The house was published widely, admired by critics and design magazines almost immediately, and it is generally credited as the single project that pushed the sunken living room from a rare architectural experiment into something homeowners across the entire country suddenly wanted for themselves. Once the idea caught fire, it spread with remarkable speed. The New York Times started mentioning conversation pits regularly by the late 1950s, and other major publications followed close behind. A description from a San Francisco newspaper in 1960 captured the feature about as well as anyone did at the time, calling it a sunken section of living room, something like a bathtub, only dry, typically shaped in a U or a circle, and finished with carpet, padding, and oversized pillows piled around the edge. The same article noted plainly that the entire point of the space was simply to talk in, a purpose stated so directly that it became something close to the feature's own unofficial slogan. By the early 1960s, what critics had originally described as an avant-garde architectural statement had become something close to standard, showing up in high-end custom homes from coast to coast, and the growing popularity of the sectional sofa, with its continuous, chair-leg-free seating, made building a pit even easier for architects and contractors working on more ordinary houses as well. Architects beyond Saarinen and Girard picked up the idea and ran with it through the same stretch of years. Paul Rudolph built one into the Cohen House in Sarasota, Florida in 1955, and the feature became something close to a signature element across much of his later residential work. Bruce Goff kept using variations of his original 1920s concept for decades, including a version built into a 1965 house in Kansas City. Saarinen himself carried the idea beyond private homes entirely, incorporating a striking red conversation pit into his celebrated 1962 TWA Flight Center at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, proving the concept could work just as well in a bustling public terminal as it did in a quiet suburban living room. By the time the feature reached the height of its cultural presence in the 1960s and into the 1970s, it was showing up everywhere, from private residences to corporate lounges, hotel lobbies, and futuristic show houses, built specifically to demonstrate what modern living was supposed to look like. Television reinforced the image just as strongly. Viewers saw a version of the same idea built directly into the set of The Dick Van Dyke Show and later into the Mary Tyler Moore Show's version of Mary's Own Apartment, cementing the sunken living room as visual shorthand for a certain kind of stylish, socially confident household. Magazines during this period went so far as publishing how-to guides walking ordinary homeowners through the process of building their own version, treating the pit as an attainable upgrade rather than something reserved purely for architect-designed showcases. Part of what made the feature so appealing went beyond simple style. Lowering the floor even a few feet created a genuine physical boundary inside an otherwise open room, without requiring a single wall to be built. It signaled to anyone standing in the main part of the house that stepping down into that space meant something different was about to happen there. A shift into conversation and connection rather than passing through on the way to somewhere else. Seated together at the same level, facing inward toward each other rather than arranged around a television or scattered across separate chairs, guests at a party found themselves pulled into exactly the kind of intimate, engaged conversation the whole design had been built to encourage in the first place. For a culture in the middle of the 20th century that placed enormous social value on entertaining at home, hosting cocktail parties and dinner gatherings that reflected directly on a family's taste and status, a conversation pit offered something close to a built-in party trick, a physical space that did half the work of making an evening feel special before a single drink had even been poured. None of that came without real, practical downsides, and critics started pointing them out disturbingly early given how quickly the feature had spread. A piece in Time magazine as far back as 1963 walked through several of the pit's more awkward consequences, with a level of specificity that made clear these were not hypothetical concerns. Anyone standing at the edge of the pit looking down had an unflattering vantage point over anyone wearing a skirt or dress seated below, an issue that period writers apparently felt comfortable discussing in surprisingly blunt terms. Eye level between the two groups lined up in genuinely strange ways, sometimes putting a standing guest's gaze roughly level with the feet of someone seated inside the pit. Food and drink carried down the steps by guests navigating an unfamiliar floor plan had an unfortunate tendency to spill or tumble, occasionally landing on the heads of the people seated below. The safety concerns ran considerably deeper than any of that, and they proved to be the issue that ultimately did the most lasting damage to the entire feature's reputation. Most pits had no railing whatsoever around their edge, a deliberate design choice meant to keep sightlines open and avoid interrupting the room's visual flow. But that same choice turned every pit into a genuine hazard for anyone who misjudged the drop, especially after a few drinks at exactly the kind of party the feature had been built to host. Small children and elderly guests faced an even more direct risk simply navigating the steps down and back up, particularly in a dimly lit room during an evening gathering. By the middle of the 1960s, home design magazines that had spent years enthusiastically promoting the feature started publishing warnings about exactly these dangers, acknowledging directly that for all of its social benefits, a sunken living room came with a real risk of injury that grew more serious the longer a party went on and the more guests had been drinking. Even with those warnings circulating, the feature held on for at least another decade past its initial peak, reaching what many designers consider its true high watermark sometime in the 1970s, rather than fading immediately once the safety concerns became public knowledge. Homeowners kept building them well into that decade, and the aesthetic itself, all shag carpet and modular seating and sculptural pendant lighting, became so closely associated with that specific era of American interior design that it eventually turned into something close to a cultural punchline, instantly recognizable, and just as instantly dated the moment tastes started shifting again. What finally pushed the conversation pit out of new home construction was less a single decisive event than a slow accumulation of practical objections stacking up against it. Building a genuinely recessed seating area required real structural work, cutting down into the floor framing in a way that added real expense and real complexity to a project, compared to simply laying flat flooring across an open room. That kind of built-in commitment made a house harder to remodel later, locking an entire section of the living room into one fixed configuration at a moment when American tastes were shifting hard toward flexible, adaptable spaces that could be rearranged as a family's needs changed over the years. Realtors and renovators increasingly came to view an existing pit as a genuine liability rather than a selling point, something that narrowed a home's potential buyer pool rather than expanding it, since plenty of prospective buyers saw nothing but a tripping hazard and an outdated design commitment sitting right in the middle of an otherwise ordinary living room. One writer studying the era's broader cultural shift argued that the pit's decline reflected something even larger happening inside American homes during this period. A gradual move away from treating the living room as a space built specifically for conversation and toward treating it instead as a media room, organized around a television rather than around each other. By the 1980s, homeowners across the country were filling in their sunken living rooms in genuinely large numbers, pouring in new subfloor to bring the room back to one uniform level and erasing what had, just a decade or two earlier, been treated as one of the most desirable features a house could possibly offer. Countless original pits disappeared this way through the final decades of the 20th century and into the early 2000s, leveled over during routine renovations by homeowners who saw little reason to preserve a feature that had come to represent little more than an outdated liability sitting in the middle of their floor plan. A genuine handful of these original pits survived purely because the houses containing them were never remodeled at all, preserved by accident rather than by any deliberate decision to keep them, tucked inside homes from the 1960s and 1970s that simply passed from one owner to the next, without anyone getting around to the kind of major renovation that would have filled the space back in. In recent years, a small but genuine architectural revival has brought the idea back in a considerably more cautious form, with modern versions built shallower, fitted with subtle railings or wider, gentler steps, and finished in updated materials meant to soften the more theatrical, campy edge of the original 1970s aesthetic. But that revival remains a deliberate, carefully engineered choice, made by architects working around exactly the safety concerns that undid the feature the first time. Nothing close to the casual, near ubiquitous presence, a sunken living room briefly held in ordinary American houses during the peak of its original run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That sunken living room once pulled your entire family and every guest down into one shared, carpeted level, built purely for talking. Next, a different feature ran quietly through the wall of your bathroom, sending warm, steady heat up through the floor tile without a single radiator or vent in sight. Section 10. Radiant floor heat. The tile floor in that bathroom always felt strangely warm, even on the coldest morning of the year, and nobody ever fully explained why. There was no radiator standing in the corner, no vent blowing air anywhere, just a floor that stayed comfortable under bare feet, no matter what the thermometer said outside. The idea itself was not new when your house got built, though it took decades of failed attempts before anyone figured out how to make it work reliably. Ancient Roman buildings used a version of the same basic principle, running heat beneath the floors of bathhouses and villas, centuries before anyone in America seriously tried it. The modern version traces back to a 1908 patent filed in the United Kingdom by a professor named Barker, covering a system of small-diameter pipes used to warm buildings from below, an idea that eventually got sold to a company called Criddle, which distributed similar systems across Northern Europe in the years that followed. In America, architect Frank Lloyd Wright experimented with early versions of the same concept for his own artistic projects, and builder William Levitt later tried scaling the idea up for the mass-produced suburban developments that came to bear his name. Both attempts ran into the same basic problem. The technology of the era, including the pipe materials available, and the general lack of proper insulation underneath the slab, was not actually ready to support the idea at the scale either man was attempting. The real golden era for radiant floor heat in American homes arrived through the 1950s and into the 1960s, driven largely by one builder in particular, whose name is still tied to the technology today. Joseph Eichler built close to 11,000 distinctive modern homes across California during these 2 decades, and nearly all of them relied on the same basic hydronic system, a boiler heating water that then circulated through a network of pipes embedded directly inside the concrete slab, turning the entire floor of the house into one giant, gentle radiator. The effect genuinely impressed people the moment they experienced it. Homeowners in these houses reportedly delighted in encouraging guests to take off their shoes, specifically so they could feel the warmth rising up through their bare feet, a small but memorable sensory detail that made the whole system feel almost luxurious compared to a standard furnace, pushing air through metal ducts and vents. Trade associations and manufacturers spent the 1940s and 1950s promoting the same basic approach, well beyond just Eichler's projects. Publishing installation instructions covering concrete slabs, wood subfloors, ceilings, walls, and even outdoor surfaces like driveways and sidewalks, meant to melt snow automatically through the winter. What made the system work was straightforward in principle, even if it proved difficult to execute reliably in practice. A boiler, usually fired by gas and often tucked away in a garage or a small utility closet, heated water to a controlled temperature and pushed it through a grid of pipes running underneath the entire floor. As that warm water circulated continuously through the slab, the concrete itself slowly absorbed and radiated that heat upward into the room above, warming the space from the ground up rather than blowing heated air down from a vent somewhere near the ceiling. There was no fan noise, no visible ductwork eating into the ceiling height, and no cold drafts near the floor, the way a forced air system sometimes produced. For houses built with dramatic floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a signature feature of the modern style these homes were built to showcase, radiant floor heat solved a genuine design problem, since a house with that much glass had almost nowhere convenient to mount a traditional radiator or bulky ductwork without ruining the clean architectural lines the whole design depended on. The problem that eventually undid the system had almost nothing to do with the idea itself, and everything to do with the specific materials available at the exact moment builders were installing it. The earliest homes built with this kind of heating, particularly those constructed during the early to mid-1950s, used galvanized steel piping embedded directly inside the concrete. Steel, it turned out, corroded steadily once any amount of oxygen found its way into the closed loop of circulating water, and once that corrosion started anywhere in the system, it tended to spread through the pipe the way a slow, hidden illness spreads through a body, worsening gradually until a leak finally broke through, somewhere the homeowner could not see or reach without tearing up the floor. The problem became serious enough and widespread enough that it eventually led to real legal consequences. Numerous steel radiant systems began failing within just a few years of installation, and by 1959, mounting complaints over these failures had already pushed Eichler's company into a lawsuit, specifically over the issue. Builders including Eichler eventually switched to copper piping by the 1960s, specifically to solve this exact corrosion problem, since copper resisted the same kind of steady decay that steel suffered underground, and homes built with copper tubing generally proved far more durable over the following decades, some running for 50 years or more before ever developing a single leak. Even copper was not a perfect solution, though it bought considerably more time than steel ever had. Copper pipes buried inside a concrete slab could still eventually develop small pinhole leaks, particularly in spots where the pipe ran through a section of concrete that flexed or cracked slightly over the years, placing repeated stress on the metal at that exact point until it finally gave way. Hard water carrying high mineral content could also slowly build up scale on the inside of copper piping, gradually narrowing the usable diameter of the pipe and reducing how much heated water could actually flow through the system. And because every single pipe involved was buried directly inside the concrete floor itself, locating an actual leak once one occurred required genuinely difficult detective work, sometimes involving pressurized air pumped through an isolated section of pipe while a technician used specialized listening equipment pressed against the floor, trying to pinpoint the exact spot where air was hissing out through a hidden crack, somewhere beneath the surface. Beyond the physical durability of the pipes themselves, the entire radiant floor approach carried a more fundamental design limitation that became increasingly obvious as American expectations around home comfort kept rising through the 1960s and 1970s. A concrete slab holds an enormous amount of thermal mass, which meant the whole system responded slowly to any change in temperature setting, taking real time to warm up when the weather turned cold, and just as long to cool back down once the heat was no longer needed. Homeowners accustomed to a forced air furnace, capable of noticeably changing a room's temperature within minutes of a thermostat adjustment, found the radiant system frustratingly sluggish by comparison. Even more significantly, these systems were built purely for heating, with no equivalent way to cool a house down during the summer months. An oversight that made increasing sense once air conditioning itself started spreading rapidly through American homes during the very same decades. Eichler and other builders working in the relatively mild climate of coastal California had never seriously needed to solve for summer cooling in the first place. But as central air conditioning became close to a standard expectation across the rest of the country, through the 1960s and into the 1970s, a heating-only system embedded permanently inside a concrete slab looked increasingly like a serious limitation, rather than a clever, forward-thinking design choice. Builders responded to all of these accumulating problems the same way builders generally respond to any expensive, failure-prone system, by simply moving away from it. Once air conditioning became the norm through the 1960s, forced air heating and cooling systems, capable of handling both jobs through the same network of ducts, became the default choice for new home construction across nearly the entire country, leaving radiant floor heat behind as a distinctive feature of a specific regional style built during a fairly narrow window of years. Homeowners living in houses that already had a radiant system installed mostly just kept using what they had, since ripping out a slab to replace the heating system buried inside it represented a genuinely enormous, disruptive undertaking, one that plenty of families simply avoided for as long as their original system kept working at all. What survives of the technology today exists in an unusual, split condition. Original Eichler homes and similar mid-century houses built with the same approach still stand across California in meaningful numbers, and a portion of them are still running on their original copper piping, occasionally suffering the same rare pinhole leak that has always plagued the system, but otherwise continuing to warm floors exactly the way they did when the house was first built decades ago. Others, particularly those unlucky enough to have been built during the specific window when steel pipe was still standard, have long since had their original heating system abandoned entirely, capped off and buried permanently beneath a floor now heated by some entirely different, modern system installed alongside it. A newer generation of radiant floor heating has since emerged using plastic PEX tubing, a material developed in Europe during the late 1960s, specifically to solve the corrosion problem that had plagued the earlier metal pipe systems, and that modern version has found a genuine, if modest, niche market among homeowners deliberately choosing the technology today, fully aware of its history, rather than simply inheriting it as the unquestioned standard, the way an entire generation of mid-century California families once did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That warm floor once heated your entire house from the ground up, using nothing but hot water hidden inside the concrete itself. Next, a different feature sat quietly built into the wall of your garage, holding tools and supplies in a space almost nobody thinks to look for anymore. Section 11. The pegboard wall. The sound came before anything else. The light metallic clink of a hammer or a wrench being lifted off two small hooks, and the strange, particular quiet of an entire wall covered in holes, waiting for whatever was supposed to go back where it belonged. The board itself, that perforated sheet of hardboard riddled with evenly spaced holes, traces back to a specific inventor working in a specific decade. A man named Lee Lyman Marshall developed what became known as pegboard sometime during the 1940s, and it eventually got marketed and manufactured under the Masonite brand, a company that had already built its name producing hardboard for a whole range of industrial and construction uses. The concept behind it was not entirely new even then. Factories and industrial workshops earlier in the century had already been experimenting with perforated boards as a way to manage tools efficiently on a shop floor, hanging equipment where workers could see at a glance whether something was missing. What Marshall and Masonite did was standardize the idea into an affordable, mass-produced product that any ordinary homeowner could buy, cut to size, and mount on a wall without needing any special industrial equipment or expertise. That transition from factory floor to family garage lined up almost perfectly, with a much bigger shift happening in American housing at exactly the same time. The post-war building boom of the late 1940s and 1950s did more than simply put a roof over millions of new families. Developers like William Levitt built entire communities where an attached garage came standard, not as some optional upgrade, but as a fundamental part of what a modern suburban house was expected to include from the very start. By the 1940s and 1950s, the attached garage had shifted from a rare luxury into something close to a basic requirement of ordinary American life. And architectural historians studying the period have pointed out that the garage itself gradually migrated over these same decades from a small, detached outbuilding tucked behind the house into a dominant feature of the home's actual front facade, eventually taking up more of the street-facing wall than the front door itself. That shift reflected something real about what families were celebrating during those years. A car sitting in a garage represented freedom and mobility, and a kind of prosperity that a generation which had lived through the Depression and wartime rationing had never taken for granted. What that garage actually became, once the car had been parked inside it, mattered just as much as the fact that a family owned one in the first place. For a lot of households through the middle of the 20th century, the garage functioned as a specific kind of space the rest of the house rarely offered, one that belonged almost entirely to whoever spent Saturday mornings out there working on something. The kitchen belonged to the whole family. The living room belonged to everyone equally, but the garage, with its concrete floor and its wall of hanging tools and a workbench bolted along the back, operated by an entirely different set of rules, closer to something personal than communal. A pegboard mounted above that workbench gave the whole space a visible order that matched the seriousness with which plenty of fathers treated their weekend projects, every wrench and screwdriver and pair of pliers hanging in its own designated spot, arranged not by whim, but according to a system that made sense to whoever had built it. The appeal of the board itself came down to a handful of genuinely practical advantages that any homeowner attempting to organize a growing collection of tools could appreciate immediately. Unlike a drawer or a closed cabinet, a pegboard kept every tool visible at a single glance, which meant nobody had to dig through a jumbled pile just to find the right size wrench. The evenly spaced holes accepted simple metal hooks that could be repositioned in seconds, which meant the entire layout could be rearranged as a tool collection grew, or as priorities shifted, without needing to buy new furniture or hire anyone to install a fresh set of shelves. And because the board itself cost relatively little compared to a full cabinet system, it became one of the most cost-effective organizational upgrades an ordinary family could make to an otherwise plain, unfinished garage wall. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the pegboard wall became something close to a defining feature of the American garage, standing right alongside the workbench itself as the two elements that turned an empty concrete box into an actual working space. It fit naturally into a broader culture that placed real value on a man's ability to fix things himself rather than pay someone else to do it. Repairing a leaky faucet or rebuilding a small engine using tools kept in exactly the condition and exact location a father had decided they belonged. Legendary hot rod builders and custom car pioneers working during this same golden age of American car culture often did their earliest work in exactly this kind of modest, garage-based workshop. Tools hung along a wall behind them, proving that a pegboard and a solid workbench could support real, serious craftsmanship rather than just casual weekend tinkering. The habit of tracing an outline around each tool, turning the board into something closer to a puzzle where every piece had one correct home, became one of the pegboard's most enduring and most personal features. That silhouette was never just decoration. It functioned as a quiet, constant reminder of exactly what belonged where, and exactly what was currently missing if a particular outline sat empty. Anyone who grew up watching a father maintain a board like this understood, without ever being told directly, that borrowing a tool came with an unspoken obligation to put it back in that exact spot once you were finished. An expectation that the outline itself enforced far more effectively than any verbal reminder ever could. What eventually diluted the pegboard's specific cultural weight had less to do with any flaw in the design itself, and more to do with how completely it succeeded at exactly what it was built to do. By the time later decades arrived, the pegboard had become so thoroughly standard across American garages that major retailers started selling entire prepackaged kits built around it, complete with color-coded hooks and matching accessories. A move that turned what had once felt like a clever, almost personal organizational solution into something closer to an ordinary, expected commodity anyone could buy off a shelf without a second thought. Once a feature becomes universal enough that literally every garage on the block has some version of the exact same setup, it stops carrying the same distinctive weight it once had. The same way a milk door or a built-in ironing board eventually stopped feeling special once it became simply what every house already came with. The larger shift, working against the pegboard's original meaning, had far more to do with what was happening to the garage as a whole than with the board mounted on its wall. As decades passed and families accumulated more possessions than any single closet or attic could reasonably hold, the garage increasingly stopped functioning as a dedicated workshop and slowly turned into something closer to general overflow storage, filled with plastic bins, seasonal decorations, and boxes left over from one move after another. A pegboard wall that had once organized a genuinely active workspace found itself competing for space with a growing pile of unrelated household clutter, and in plenty of houses, the board itself simply disappeared behind stacked boxes and unused sporting equipment, its careful outlines gathering dust behind whatever had been shoved in front of it during the last cleanup that never quite finished. Even as garages across the country slid into this kind of general storage purgatory, a genuine subset of homeowners never let go of the original idea, and in some ways, the pegboard's meaning only intensified for exactly this group as the decades wore on. For men who kept working on cars, kept fixing things themselves rather than calling a professional, the wall of hanging tools remained exactly what it had always been, a visible, functional expression of real ongoing skill rather than nostalgic decoration. Retailers built entire premium tool storage lines specifically around this continued demand, selling heavy, well-built rolling chests and cabinets alongside pegboard sections, treating the wall-mounted board as a permanent, unkillable fixture of serious home workshop design, regardless of what happened to it in the more casually maintained garages down the street. What survives of the original pegboard tradition today exists in something close to two separate forms living side by side. In one, it remains exactly what it always was, a genuinely practical, actively used tool wall in the garage of anyone who still builds and repairs things with their own hands. Updated now with metal or plastic construction instead of the original hardboard, but functionally identical to the version Marshall patented decades earlier. In the other, it survives mostly as a nostalgic visual shorthand, instantly recognizable to anyone who grew up watching a parent work in a garage exactly like the ones described: oil-stained concrete, a workbench along the back wall, and a board full of careful pencil outlines marking exactly where every single tool belonged, whether or not anyone in the house today still remembers to put things back where the outline says they should go. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That wall of careful outlines once turned an ordinary garage into your father's own quiet workshop, every tool exactly where it belonged. Next, a different feature hummed quietly in a corner of your parents' bedroom, filling the room with music long before anyone owned a single portable speaker. Section 12, the console stereo. That piece of furniture sat low and long in the corner of the living room, made of real wood with a hinged lid that lifted up to reveal a turntable spinning quietly underneath. The kind of object that was furniture first and electronics second, meant to blend into the room the same way a credenza might. The idea of hiding an entire audio system inside a single piece of furniture goes back further than the version your family likely owned. Thomas Edison's original phonograph, invented in 1877, was the first device capable of reproducing recorded sound at all, but it looked and functioned like a piece of laboratory equipment rather than anything meant to sit in a living room. That changed in 1906, when an engineer named Eldridge Johnson refined Emil Berliner's earlier gramophone design into something called the Victrola, elegantly hiding the entire mechanism inside a wooden cabinet built to blend into a room's existing decor rather than standing out as obvious machinery. The Victrola only played mono recordings, and its sound quality bore little resemblance to what came later, but it established the basic template that would define home audio furniture for the next several decades. A single piece that housed the whole system rather than scattering separate components around the room. For much of the first half of the 20th century, that basic template held steady, with large console radios and simple record players serving as the standard living room fixture. Early phonograph speakers built into these units tended to sound thin and tinny by later standards, since the technology for genuinely rich, accurate sound reproduction had not yet caught up with the ambition of the furniture housing it. Everything changed with the rise of what came to be called the high-fidelity movement in the years following World War II, as returning veterans who had picked up electronics training during their service, some through the GI Bill, began building and improving audio equipment with a level of technical seriousness the hobby had not seen before. The term hi-fi itself, short for high fidelity, emerged during this period specifically to describe systems built around the goal of reproducing sound as accurately and cleanly as possible, with minimal distortion between the original recording and whatever came out of the speaker. Small specialty companies sprang up almost overnight to serve this new wave of returning veterans and curious hobbyists. Some focused entirely on cabinets and enclosures for people who wanted a serious speaker but had no talent for woodworking themselves. Others focused purely on the drivers and crossovers hidden inside those cabinets. One speaker maker went from offering just 5 different driver models in 1950 to more than 35 different options only 2 years later. A pace of growth that says something about how quickly ordinary Americans, the real transformation, the one that turned your family's living room console into a genuine centerpiece rather than just background furniture, arrived with the shift from mono to stereo sound through the middle and late 1950s. A 1958 edition of the Hi-Fi Yearbook flatly declared that year the first true year of stereo playback, at least as far as the pickups and cartridges reading the records were concerned. And by the early 1960s, stereo had firmly established itself as the new standard, giving listeners a genuinely immersive left and right channel experience that mono simply could not replicate. Major manufacturers built entire product lines around this new capability, with companies like Zenith, Magnavox, Grundig, and Motorola producing console cabinets that combined a turntable, an AM and FM radio tuner, and a full stereo speaker system inside one carefully finished piece of hardwood furniture. Motorola's advertising for its 1962 stereo hi-fi line specifically bragged about using 3 separate amplifiers and 3 separate speaker systems rather than the usual 2, promising customers a level of tonal purity that matched the fine furniture pieces the cabinet was designed to sit alongside. Overseas manufacturers competed directly for the same American living rooms. Telefunken, based in Germany, expanded its own console line through the mid-1950s and kept refining it through what many collectors now consider its golden era in the 1960s and 1970s, selling models like the Symphony and the more affordable Allegro series, both domestically and through heavy exports to the United States. Proof that the console format had become something close to an international standard for how a serious household was expected to listen to music. Owning one of these consoles carried real social weight through the 1960s and into the 1970s, in a way that went well beyond simple musical enjoyment. A console hi-fi sitting prominently in the living room told visitors something specific about the household that owned it, signaling a level of comfort and modern taste that a simple table radio never could. The cabinets themselves were treated as genuine furniture pieces first, and audio equipment second, built with real hardwood veneers, French provincial styling in some lines, sleek Scandinavian-influenced lines in others, designed by furniture houses and finished with the same techniques used on any other high-quality piece sitting in the room. Some manufacturers pushed the furniture side of the equation even further than simply matching an existing decor. Certain console models built through the 1950s and 1960s came fitted with a hidden bar compartment tucked into one side of the cabinet, letting a host lift open one panel to reveal a turntable and another to reveal glassware and a bottle of something to pour, turning the console into the literal centerpiece of an evening's entertaining rather than just its soundtrack. Advertisements from the period leaned into this dual identity directly. describing a particular model's cabinet as among the best-looking selection of all hardwood cabinets a buyer had ever seen, treating the appearance of the piece as every bit as important a selling point as whatever technical specifications lay hidden inside it. What eventually displaced the console did not happen through any single dramatic failure of the format, but through a genuine philosophical shift in how serious listeners wanted to build their sound systems in the first place. Component-based systems, built from separate individual pieces, a receiver, a standalone turntable, freestanding speakers set apart from each other, had actually existed alongside consoles since the earliest days of the hi-fi movement, favored mostly by dedicated hobbyists and professional installers willing to hand-pick individual pieces rather than buy one integrated unit. Through the 1950s, these separate component setups remained a niche pursuit for people patient enough to research individual speaker drivers, amplifiers, and cabinets, while the vast majority of ordinary households simply bought a single all-in-one console and considered the matter settled. That balance began shifting meaningfully through the 1960s and into the 1970s, driven by a wave of younger, college-aged consumers who wanted the ability to mix and match individual pieces rather than commit to a single manufacturer's complete furniture package. Advances in electronics helped accelerate this shift directly. The widespread availability of cheap, reliable silicon transistors made it economically practical for manufacturers to combine a power amplifier, preamplifier, and tuner into a single compact receiver chassis, driving down costs and making a genuinely capable component system considerably more affordable for an ordinary buyer than it had been just a decade earlier. This new generation of receivers arrived at almost the exact moment the massive baby boomer population was reaching college age, with real spending money of its own, a demographic wave large enough to reshape what the entire audio industry considered its primary customer. Separating the speakers from the main unit turned out to matter for reasons beyond simple flexibility, too. Proper stereo reproduction genuinely benefited from speakers spaced apart from each other rather than crammed together inside a single console cabinet, since real channel separation depended on the two speakers sitting at a meaningful distance apart in the room. As listeners and audio engineers increasingly understood this, the single cabinet console design became something of a technical compromise, dressed up as elegant furniture, sacrificing genuine audio performance for the sake of a tidy, unified look. Companies like Acoustic Research, and the team that eventually broke off to found KLH, pushed hard on exactly this point through the late 1950s and 1960s, marketing compact bookshelf speakers engineered to outperform far larger console-mounted drivers, proving to a growing number of serious listeners that bigger furniture did not automatically mean better sound. By the early 1970s, home audio systems were increasingly built from 3 separate boxes rather than one, and manufacturers began favoring plastic and other lighter materials over the heavy furniture-grade wood that had defined the console era, prioritizing performance and portability over the kind of substantial, decorative cabinetry that had once been half the point of owning one. Experimental formats like quadraphonic sound, which briefly promised 4-channel playback surrounding a listener from every direction, only reinforced the shift towards separate, individually placed speakers rather than one sealed cabinet incapable of ever supporting that kind of arrangement. By the time cassette decks, and later compact discs, entered the picture through the late 1970s and 1980s, the console format had been thoroughly overtaken by component systems as the format any serious music listener actually wanted. The advent of digital audio rendered several aspects of the old console format genuinely obsolete rather than simply unfashionable, and audiophiles who had come to appreciate the flexibility of swapping in a better turntable or a new set of speakers without replacing the entire unit had little interest in going back to a single sealed cabinet that offered no such flexibility at all. Manufacturers who had built their reputations on beautifully finished console furniture, including companies like Telefunken, struggled through these decades to adapt their product lines fast enough to keep pace, eventually abandoning the traditional console format entirely, even as their vintage models kept a devoted following among collectors. What survives of the console today exists mostly as exactly that, a collector's object rather than a living room necessity. Vintage examples from the 1950s and 1960s, particularly those built by well-regarded furniture designers or fitted with genuinely capable speaker components inside, now sell as prized pieces among mid-century modern collectors, valued as much for their cabinetry as for whatever audio equipment still functions inside them. A small cottage industry has even emerged around retrofitting these old cabinets with modern internals, fitting a genuinely capable amplifier, a new belt-driven turntable, and Bluetooth or Wi-Fi streaming connectivity inside the original hardwood shell, letting someone stream music from a phone through a piece of furniture built decades before streaming existed. Even hotels and restaurants have started installing these retrofitted consoles deliberately, treating them as a genuine conversation piece, capable of drawing guests over simply to admire the cabinet and ask what it is. For anyone who grew up watching a parent lift that hinged lid and lower a needle onto a spinning record, the console remains one of the more physical, tactile memories of how a house used to fill itself with music, one deliberate, unhurried motion at a time, rather than the instant, weightless convenience that eventually replaced it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That console once filled your entire living room with music from a single, carefully finished piece of furniture, built specifically to hide the machinery inside it. Next, a different feature waited quietly by the front door, holding muddy boots and wet coats in a small room built purely to keep the rest of the house clean. Section 13. The Mudroom. That small room by the side door never got much attention until the exact moment you needed it. Boots caked in snow, a coat dripping onto the mat, a dog shaking off rainwater before anyone could stop it. You called it the Mudroom, and it sat between the outside world and the rest of the house like a filter, catching everything the weather and the yard tried to drag in before it ever reached the carpet. Nobody explained why it was there. It was just the room you walked through, coat half off, before you ever set foot in the kitchen. The word itself, and the room it described, only really took hold in American houses during a specific decade, even though something like it had existed in one form or another for much longer. Farmhouses across New England and the rural Midwest had long kept a small entry space near the kitchen door, specifically for shedding boots, coats, and barn work clothes before stepping into the house proper, a practical necessity for anyone who spent the day working outdoors and could not track that mess through a home with no washing machine and no easy way to clean a floor twice a day. English homes had their own version of the same basic idea for centuries before that. A boot room tucked near a back entrance where a household's outdoor gear lived permanently, separate from anything worn indoors. But the mudroom as a distinct named feature of an ordinary suburban house emerged more clearly in the 1950s, tied directly to a specific wave of home design that swept the country during that decade. Builders working through the post-war boom leaned heavily into a revival of colonial architecture, putting up Cape Cod houses, gambrel-roofed Dutch colonials, and blocky New England-style forms that borrowed heavily from early American building traditions, evoking garrisons on the old Massachusetts frontier as much as they evoked any specific practical need. That colonial revival carried a certain emotional weight at the time, arriving at the height of the Cold War, when a home built to evoke the country's revolutionary past felt reassuring to families living through real anxiety about Sputnik overhead, the early tremors of the civil rights movement, and a rapidly changing social order that unsettled plenty of households even as it improved others. A mudroom, tucked between the garage and the kitchen, or the back door and the kitchen, fit naturally into that nostalgic architectural language, a small practical space that also happened to look like something a family might have had 2 centuries earlier, lending a brand new tract house in a brand new subdivision a small, comforting sense of continuity with an older, more settled version of American life. For families who actually lived on or near farmland, the mudroom was never simply a decorative nod to the past. It functioned as a constant, genuine necessity, the exact spot where muddy boots came off, before anyone walked through the rest of the house, where a barn coat hung on its own hook, rather than crowding a closet meant for church clothes, where the practical, dirty work of maintaining a household met the clean, presentable rooms meant for guests and family life. A family running a working farm depended on that division in a way that suburban households never quite had to. Milking clothes, feed dust, manure tracked in on a boot, none of it belonged anywhere near a kitchen table where the same family ate dinner an hour later, and the mudroom existed specifically to stop that transfer before it ever happened. Even in houses with no farm attached at all, that same basic function mattered enormously once a family owned a car, a yard, and the kind of active outdoor life that post-war suburban living encouraged. Kids playing outside all afternoon, a father coming in from mowing the lawn, a mother returning from the garden, all of them needed somewhere to shed the outside world before stepping onto a floor the rest of the household walked across in socks. The room found its place naturally within the broader shift happening in American home design during the very same years. Ranch-style houses, which came to dominate residential construction through the 1950s and 1960s, prioritized sprawling single-story floor plans built around a seamless connection to the outdoors. Exactly the kind of layout that made a transitional space between the yard and the kitchen genuinely useful, rather than an afterthought. Split-level homes, which gained real popularity through the 1960s and 1970s, as families looked for more usable space without expanding a house's overall footprint, often placed the garage on its own staggered level entirely, with a short run of steps leading directly up into a mudroom before continuing on toward the main living areas, physically enforcing the separation between outside dirt and inside cleanliness through the layout of the house itself, rather than relying purely on habit. As garages increasingly attached directly to the house, rather than sitting as a separate structure out back, a growing share of a family's floor plan got devoted specifically to managing that transition point. The space where you stepped out of a car, walked past the lawnmower and the garden tools, and crossed into the part of the house where everyone actually lived. A mudroom positioned exactly there let a family keep that boundary firmly in place, catching the dirt and the clutter before either one had a chance to spread any further into the house. The room typically did not need to be elaborate to do its job well. A functional mudroom from this era usually amounted to little more than a small, tiled or linoleum-floored space, just large enough for a bench, a row of hooks along one wall, and sometimes a closet for boots and umbrellas, positioned directly between an exterior door and the kitchen, so that nobody could reach the rest of the house without passing through it first. Some builders treated it almost like an airlock, a small vestibule that also helped conserve heat in the winter and block hot air in the summer, since a door opening directly into the main living space would have let outside temperatures rush straight into the house every single time somebody came in or out. That dual purpose, part cleaning station, part climate buffer, made the room worth the modest square footage it took up even in houses where every foot of floor plan was already being carefully rationed. Families with young children found the mudroom doing double duty almost immediately, evolving from a place purely for dirt and weather into something closer to a small, informal command center for managing an entire household's comings and goings. Hooks meant for coats ended up holding backpacks. A bench meant for removing boots became the spot where a mother tied a child's shoes before school. Some families kept a small shelf or cubby system there, specifically to organize mittens, hats, and the countless small winter accessories that otherwise scattered themselves across an entire house within a single season. None of this required any redesign of the room itself. The mudroom simply absorbed these extra functions naturally, precisely because it already sat at the exact choke point every family member passed through multiple times a day. What eventually thinned the mudroom's presence in new home construction had less to do with any flaw in the room itself, and everything to do with a much bigger shift in how Americans wanted their homes to feel from the inside. Starting in the later decades of the 20th century and accelerating hard through the 1990s and 2000s, open concept floor plans took over as the dominant style buyers wanted, tearing down the walls that had once divided a house into a series of distinct, separately functioning rooms. A mudroom, by definition, depended on exactly the kind of separation an open concept house was actively working against. A small, closed-off buffer zone specifically designed to contain mess, rather than let it flow openly into the rest of the home. Builders chasing the open, airy feel buyers increasingly wanted often shrank the mudroom down to little more than a wide hallway with a few hooks on the wall, or eliminated the dedicated room entirely in favor of a simple bench and closet tucked just inside the garage door, treating the function as something that could be handled in passing, rather than something that deserved its own enclosed space. The garage itself absorbed a growing share of the mudroom's original job during this same period, for reasons that had nothing to do with design trends and everything to do with how a family's floor plan was already being allocated. As attached garages grew larger and consumed more of a home's total square footage through the 1960s and 1970s, that space naturally became the first stop after stepping out of a car, and a family's shoes, coats, and sports equipment increasingly ended up staged there instead of in any dedicated room built specifically for the purpose. A garage was never quite as effective at the job as a proper mudroom, since it lacked the tile floor, the heating, and the direct connection to the kitchen that made the original room so useful. But it filled enough of the same function that plenty of builders simply stopped bothering to design a separate space at all. The irony, much like with several of the other features already covered, is that American homes kept growing larger during exactly the same stretch of decades when the mudroom itself was shrinking or disappearing from many new floor plans. The average new home ballooned from roughly 1,100 square feet in the 1950s to well over 2,000 by the early 2000s. And yet the specific, humble transitional space that once handled the daily collision between outside dirt and inside cleanliness increasingly lost its dedicated square footage to larger kitchens, bigger closets, and sprawling open living areas that buyers found more visually appealing on a walkthrough. A larger house, it turned out, did not automatically mean a more practically organized one. For families with active kids playing sports, the exact kind of household a mudroom was originally built to serve, that loss became a genuine practical problem, one that eventually sparked its own quiet revival. That revival arrived gradually, driven largely by families who discovered just how badly they missed the room once it was gone. Home renovation shows and real estate searches through the 2000s and 2010s increasingly featured buyers specifically requesting a mudroom as a must-have feature, often citing children's sports equipment, winter boots, and general household clutter as the exact justification farmers and rural families had relied on for generations. One frequently cited example from a real estate television program showed a young couple house hunting specifically because their 3 sons played hockey, and the heroic amount of gear that came with that particular sport simply demanded a dedicated space no ordinary hallway closet could hold. Their eventual choice featured a mudroom built with real ambition behind it, a gleaming space with a built-in hall tree offering 4 separate storage bays, modern front-loading laundry equipment tucked into the same room, and a slate-tiled floor with heating installed directly underneath it. A level of investment that would have seemed almost absurd applied to a room originally meant to hold nothing more than muddy boots and a couple of coat hooks. Modern versions of the room came back considerably more polished than their mid-century ancestors, as this renewed demand spread through the broader housing market. Builders and renovators began treating the mudroom as a genuine design opportunity, rather than a purely utilitarian afterthought, finishing it with real materials meant to be seen, rather than simply endured. Built-in cubbies labeled for each individual family member. A small desk or charging station tucked into one corner for managing mail and homework. And dedicated laundry equipment installed directly into the same space, specifically because families increasingly wanted their dirtiest clothes handled at the exact same choke point where the dirt itself first entered the house. That combination, mudroom and laundry room, merged into one, made a certain practical sense that would have been obvious to any farm family a century earlier, even if it took American suburban design several decades to circle back around to essentially the same conclusion. Real estate professionals working through this same period increasingly cited a well-designed mudroom as a genuine selling point, rather than a minor amenity, something buyers specifically asked about during a showing, rather than simply appreciating once they had already moved in. That shift mirrored, in miniature, the exact same arc so many of the other household features already covered had traveled. A once standard, unremarkable feature that quietly disappeared from new construction for a generation or two, only to resurface later as a deliberately marketed selling point once enough families had lived without it long enough to genuinely miss what it once did for them. What survives today sits somewhere between those two versions, part practical necessity and part aspirational feature, featured heavily in home design magazines and renovation shows. A genuinely old mudroom, the kind built into a 1950s Cape Cod or Dutch colonial, still does its job in plenty of houses that have never been remodeled. A small plain room with hooks on the wall and a boot tray on the floor, doing exactly what it was built to do without anyone in the family giving it a second thought. The same quiet, unglamorous function it has always performed since the day the house was framed. A newer version, built or added specifically because a family wanted one back, tends to be larger, better organized, and considerably more photographed, complete with the kind of finishes and built-ins that would have seemed like a genuine extravagance to the farm families and post-war suburban households who first made the room a fixture of ordinary American life. Both versions do essentially the same job in the end, catching the outside world at the door and giving a family one last chance to shed it before stepping into the part of the house everyone actually lives in. Proof that even after decades of open-concept living tried to erase the idea entirely, the basic need for a buffer between the mess of the outside world and the calm of the inside one never really went away. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.